So hey, thanks so much for coming in person. The title that I Safe Spaces, Balancing Academic Freedom and Wokeness. I want to talk about three challenges, and I'm not going to be able to give the answer to them, but I do want to try to organize what I'm saying with these three challenges. Universities in the United States have got to apportion governance. We have to decide who's in charge. Second, we have to apportion responsibility for payment and tuition. There's a lot of claims that college should be free. Well, I have bad news. It's not free. The question is, who's going to pay the enormous amount of money that it takes? And then third, who is authorized to make hires, to invite speakers, and who can veto speakers and subjects on campus? So let me start out with a metonymy. And we could have a quiz about who all majored in English. Remember what metonymy is. But a metonymy is when we take a symbol and use it to stand in for something larger. So you'll often hear on the news today, the White House said. Well, the White House didn't say anything. White House is a building. So I would like to propose that we think of universities as four metonymies. First, the clock tower. Now, the clock tower organizes time. And one of the difficulties about universities that supposedly MOOCs was going to solve was the fact that education is available between 11 and 12:15 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Well, actually, education is an ongoing process. And so the tyranny, the Procrustean tyranny of the clock tower is something that many people have thought would be the end of universities because we can have videos. Well, there is something about a shared experience. Y'all could all be doing this online, and in fact, we've repeatedly expressed our relief at being able to get in our car after getting to get dressed up and then come together and share this experience. It's a lot more trouble. You could be drinking bourbon in your pajamas at home, but instead you're here. So there's something about the shared experience that counts for something. So the fact that if you go to a Broadway show or to a movie, the existence of the clock tower in the university where you do things together is something different than you could get from an a la carte educational experience. Second, the stadium, which is almost self-explanatory. And let me settle that question. I am a Carolina fan. I went to Davidson and Duke always kicked our butt. So I've always hated Duke, and even though I've 25 years, I've never recovered from that. Now, many faculty lament the importance of athletics at college, but there's a whole lot of people who went to the college that their father or mother went to because of what happened on Saturday afternoon, not because of what was in their library. So the fact that we have these tribal loyalties is something that's important about universities, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is important for us to have complex affiliations. So I think that's something that is not easily unbundled. The third building is the student union. And this relates to the subject of my talk. The student union and fraternity parties are a combination of associations and the greatest dating service in the world. You're with a lot of people who are more or less the same educational level, the same social class, and for the most part, it's hard for outsiders to get in. So a lot of people, whether or not they get married, a lot of people are interested in the social aspects of college. And to foreshadow my main argument, the reason that I'm in favor of safe spaces, is that I think freedom of speech has almost no important place in universities. The main thing that's important about academic freedom is the freedom of association. First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees 5 freedoms: speech, press, religion, association, and then the right of petition for grievance. Nobody remembers that. So the big important thing about academic freedom is not freedom of speech. You don't get to stand up in some professor's lecture and say whatever you want. What you get is freedom of association. You get individual groups that organize themselves on an exclusive basis. Now, I was in a fraternity, my younger son was in a fraternity. I would defend exclusive associations that are voluntary as a really important part of growing up. And I'm going to talk more about the freedom of association at universities as an important part of safe spaces, but here's my thesis. Universities are places where any authorized person can have an outside speaker or can form a group. No one else gets to annex the entire university for their own purposes. That is, if I want to have a speaker, I can. If you want to have a speaker, you can. But neither of us can tell the other person what speakers they can have. All groups get to form. And so the difficulty with that is many people will agree, except that they want to have in the speakers that they want, and they also want to prevent you from having the speakers that you want. But my freedom to do that is the same as your freedom. So the student union and social groups is a really important building. And then last, this is one that you all know, the admissions office. So the admissions building is a big part of the value of universities. Now my friend Brian Kaplan says that that may be the only important value of universities, at least for most majors, because the fact that you were admitted at an elite school is really important as a signal of your future value of something or other. You were able to do a lot of things that mean that you're compliant and you don't have a criminal record. So I can figure out a lot of things about you from just learning that you were admitted. So, in fact, in some ways, even though elite universities are expensive, they're not charging nearly enough. Recently, Operation Varsity Blues showed that people were willing to spend, in addition, hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to try to get their kids admission. So the value of college admission at an elite university is enormous. Now, you might want to ask why that is. Perhaps we can take that up again later. Well, let me talk a little bit about governance and the Nicole Hannah-Jones case. Because that's the question of governance. Now, the facts of the case are this. In April and May, UNC tried to put together an offer to a prominent journalist who was going to be offered the ninth chair. And it's going to be at the Hussman School of Journalism at the University of North Carolina, which is a prestigious journalism school. Now, the file was put up pretty late and it was pretty thin. Now, let me say that hurry up and wait is the routine of these sort of bureaucratic procedures. My own file at Duke University, when I was put up for tenure, it took 18 months and 3 returns. So it went up, it got sent back because it was incomplete, it was sent back again, it was sent back again. It took 18 months. I had a quote from him about Trustee Duncan. So Chuck Duckett asked questions regarding the tenured candidacy of Nicole Hannah-Jones and suggested more time and postponed the review to consider these questions. Now, they meet once a month, and so it was postponed until the following month. She was never denied tenure, there was never a vote on tenure, and what happened was, because the file was incomplete, it was sent back and they asked for additional information. Absolutely common. The result was that UNC, because they were in a hurry, and this is not impossible, they said, well, let's go ahead and make her an offer with a 5-year renewable contract. And then once she gets on campus, we'll go ahead, and maybe before that, we'll get the tenure case through. Those were the terms under which I went to Duke. I did not have tenure because we had not yet processed the case. However, the story was, and I think it was up to and including the New York Times, that said that she was denied tenure. That is absurdly false. What happened was that the Hussman School plausibly decided that they would make her the 5-year renewable term offer so as to get her on campus in September. She accepted that offer. She accepted that offer as being okay, and then the dean decided that she would go public with the story that it was just a shame that this was the first night chair that had not been tenured. And people said, hey, yeah. Well, there's a perfectly good reason why that was true. They could have waited until the following year. But presumably they wanted to get through. So all of this, everything that came about as a result. So I just wanted to get that story, which many of you likely already know. I wanted to get that out of the way. What I want to do is now take up the effects that that case has had on the trustees and the board of governors. Because there was a response, there was a public backlash against the trustees who had, and eventually did vote her up for tenure. And I did some research about the history of the role of trustees. So I'm looking at a larger question now. What are the rights and obligations of the Board of Trustees of a university? What are they supposed to do? What can they do in terms of governing the curriculum and faculty hiring? Well, Professor Henry Manning, who founded what's now the Scalia Law School at George Mason University, in 1971 published a book on faculty governance. And this may sound familiar, but remember, this is 50 years ago, 1971, so it's exactly 50 years ago. There is no longer any way for trustees to keep faculty members in line. There is not even a line for trustees as such at all. Their interest in serving has become only the weaker need of community status or prestige. Instead of being directed by trustees, the modern private university has become democratized, with an almost total loss of trustees' control over student admissions, faculty hiring, and curriculum. So, one of the core beliefs of the modern academy, that is, my colleagues in the professoriate, would say that it's offensive to have outside political interference. And by political interference, they mean by the Board of Trustees. So they would argue that outside political interference is both morally offensive because it violates their fundamental academic rights, and it's prudentially mistaken in the sense that it's going to make the university worse. So the claim is that the best universities are those that are governed entirely by the faculty. And the reason that those are the best universities is that they are governed by the faculty. That's not an accident. Well, when you look at the history of the right of faculty to enjoy academic freedom and self-governance, you start to think about the generic problem of control of nonprofit management. If you look at a for-profit firm, what is the firm governed by? It's governed by the profit test. You have to be able to make a product that, when you sell it for a price consumers are willing to pay, will allow you to pay off all of your suppliers and contracts and still have something left over. That's the signal that this is worth doing. So the profit signal is a pretty objective test. Well, for a nonprofit organization, almost by definition, you don't have that kind of test. So the question is, how do we solve that problem for nonprofits? And the answer is that we have a board of trustees. They are literally people who are entrusted with overseeing the activity of people who otherwise would have a conflict of interest. They have a conflict of interest in the sense that they can give themselves excessive salaries because there is no profit test, and they can divert the activities of the organization in directions away from those intended by donors. So the safeguard is you want to have trustees in order to continue to get revenue from donors. And it is, after all, the donor's intent, acting on donor intent, that ensures that donors will continue to participate and contribute. The notion of academic freedom, then, as a founding principle, is unsurprisingly just a misrepresentation. And in fact, American universities, far from having academic freedom, were, for the most part, established by religious organizations or by boards of trustees who saw themselves as being responsible for the public trust. Now, Hofstadter's 1955 book in 1955 wrote a book about the history of academic freedom. And much of the book is about UNC Chapel Hill. So it's not a very well-known book, but I do recommend it. He described an 1856 incident with a UNC professor. So just like Nicole Hannah-Jones, here is a UNC professor, a chemistry professor, Benjamin Hedrick, was asked by a student who he favored in the upcoming US presidential election. Hedrick said he would likely vote for John Fremont, who was a Republican who opposed the admission of new slave territories. There was an immediate backlash when the student revealed this to some classmates and other faculty. And to quote Hofstadter now, colleges were often chronically so near disaster that presidents or professors felt a moral obligation to resign, lest they bring upon their school its death blow. What is most interesting in comparison to the modern professoriate is the absence of the feeling that their professional competence gives them any right to cling to their jobs. The general feeling seems to have been that strong criticism obliged them to resign. A man like Benjamin Hedrick was thought to be exceptionally willful and stubborn because he refused to resign his post at the University of North Carolina and forced the trustees to fire him. There was no question but that the trustees could fire him. What was offensive was that he didn't just resign when someone came to him privately and said, look, you're embarrassing the university. Do you notice a difference now? Who's under pressure to resign because they've embarrassed the university? The trustees! The trustees are the ones who embarrassed the university. We've had a complete flip in responsibility. So originally, institutions of higher learning had used the trust form of organization where donors had specific religious goals for secular purposes, like schools of medicine or high school teachers. So a powerful and active board of trustees is necessary for attracting donors and supporters. If the university manages in two ways to rid itself of having to worry about a source of funding, then the role of the trustees is going to be diminished. One possibility is to have, and I know this could never happen, an enormous endowment, which would do just constantly, you don't say what you're going to do or why, you just say, please give, we have a $7 billion endowment, and it would be better if it were even bigger. So please give. The alternative would be, and this is a little bit more of a trick, politicians should give us taxpayers' money, but not put any strings or restrictions on it. They just should because we are so awesome. I look in the mirror and I say, damn, don't you ever die. Now I'm paraphrasing. But that seems to be the argument that faculty, that seems to be the characterization of academic freedom that many faculty have. So Manny, again, in 1971, said, the notion of academic freedom has given the faculty effective power over subject matter in the university and over its curriculum. Especially in very technical fields, this represented the trustees deferring to the expertise of the faculty. The last sporadic fights for the vestiges of control left in the hands of trustees are now being waged. These disruptions may frequently result in great losses of time or embarrassment or unfavorable publicity. 50 years ago, but ripped from the headlines. So in Manny's view, the main job of the trustees and the president is fundraising. Shut up and go out and get us more money. And we, the faculty, will decide how that should be spent. It's had the knock-on effect on the nature of university's top administration. They're going to choose a president who understands that his or her only job is to raise funds. So the job of the administration is to raise money for faculty to use as they wish. Since neither quality nor expense is a direct concern, the kind of faculty who survive and prosper in this cooperative or collectivist environment inherently favor, quoting from Manny now, inherently favor collectivist, statist, non-market attitudes. So Manny wonders, are there any reforms that might help solve this problem? And he suggests a system where faculty actually had a share in the number of students, the quality of the education. I don't know how you would measure those things, in the sense that faculty are withdrawing money from a general fund, much like overfishing for cod in the Northwest Atlantic. And so the overfishing problem happens because no one has any personal stake in the outcome. So the question is it possible to give faculty more of a stake? I've not heard, so I mentioned that just because as far as I know, no one has taken that up. So there remains another alternative to that proposal, and that is what we might call the dictatorship of the trustees. And I think it's interesting that there are very few universities that are like that. Why? Why is that? Is it because it's too hard to recruit faculty? But there is one important one that I myself have visited, some of you may have also. So in Guatemala, the Universidad Francisco Marroquín, which was founded by Manuel Ayau, and he describes in an interview with Liberty Fund the process by which their university was established. The Board of Trustees is involved in what's being taught, and it's very much involved in checking the performance of the professors. We have a philosophy, and it will shock many academicians, that the university exists in the exercise of academic freedom of the trustees, and that the university hires the professors that agree with our views, and that we respect the freedom of professors to teach otherwise and to teach contrary to what we believe elsewhere. Now, that's one of the best universities in South America. So in fact, there are models of trustee dictatorship. It is possible to organize. And I'm not saying that's the only model that should exist. But the question is, why has it happened in the US that over and over again, what looks like competition for faculty has resulted in a model where the so-called elite universities have enormous endowments that insulate them from having to worry about quality or public opinion. And they allow the faculty constantly to expand that independence. Well, suppose, for the sake of argument, that I would have voted no in a faculty meeting on Nicole Hannah-Jones. I'm not sure that I would have. I've not seen the file. She actually seems very impressive. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that in a faculty meeting I would have voted no. Should the trustees have turned her down? I think in the existing system, they cannot. In the existing system, that ship has sailed. We have to allow deference to faculty decisions. The only thing that's left for trustees to do is to decide whether to get rid of entire units. That is, has the faculty of the journalism school simply abdicated their responsibility to provide education and we're going to do something else. So I don't think that it's any longer possible for trustees to do what the trustees in this case tried to do, which was to exercise oversight. So I think that it was like after Lehman Brothers in 2007 went belly up and then there was no bailout. There was a, wait a minute, this is violating our expectations, and people go nuts. Now, it was the right thing to do to not bail out Lehman Brothers, but not at that time, not given those expectations. So given the system that we're in, I don't think there's anything else that the trustees could have done. Well, let me say a little bit now about safe spaces. I've tried to start at 10,000 feet and have come down now closer to ground level. I want to come out in favor of safe spaces at universities. Not everywhere and not for all purposes, but any constituted group should be able to establish a safe space at a university, and the payoff for that is that other groups get to do it too. Now, that means that you get to exclude others. You get to exclude people who do not share your beliefs. And if you're the only member of your group, that's not going to be a very good group. So we decide how groups work by whether or not other people want to join them. Safe spaces for students then must include ideologically selected groups, social groups. All of that comes about because of freedom of association. So I want to argue that the fundamental importance of academic freedom is freedom of association. If my Department of Political Science wants to have in a speaker, no one else can say, no, you have to have a different speaker, you have to have a different approach. We actually get to pursue the line of reasoning that we have been empowered to take on. Now I have a quiz. I'm sort of late, you've had lunch, wake up. Identify the speaker. I'm going to read a quote, it's fairly lengthy. Identify the speaker. I bet none of you can do it. I've got tough talk for you liberals at universities. There are two ideas about safe spaces. One is a very good idea, and one is a terrible idea. The idea of being physically safe, not being subject to violent threats and abuse or being targeted personally for racial epithets. That's fine. That's a good idea. So if that's what you mean by being safe, then okay. But there's another view, one that is now ascendant, which I think is just a horrible view. And that is that I need to be safe ideologically and emotionally. I just need to feel good all the time. And if someone somewhere on my college campus says something that upsets me, that is a problem for the administration. That's a terrible idea. I don't want you to be safe. I want you to be strong. And there's a difference. Nobody can pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the point of the gym. To break you down and cause pain so you can become strong. Debate is the gym of universities. And at this point, his voice, I'm giving away that it's a man, his voice rises in indignation and disbelief, and I will mimic his gestures. You can't feel safe on a campus just because some people say stuff you don't like. They can't fire you, arrest you, or threaten you, and you get to say stuff back. And this, you cannot bear. This is ridiculous BS, liberals. Protesters dealt with fire hoses and dogs and beatings. You can't deal with a mean tweet? You are creating a kind of liberalism that the minute it leaves the college campus is not just useless, but obnoxious and dangerous. I want you to be offended every day. You have to learn how to speak back with people you disagree with without becoming offended and never thinking you can win arguments by playing the victim. All right, who was that?
Barack Obama.
It was Van Jones.
That's close.
Barack Obama has in fact said some things that were close to that. But so this is Van Jones. And if you're having trouble picturing Van Jones, he's the commentator on CNN that pisses you off so much that they choose to. But, and I have to also give credit to a Duke colleague of mine, Melissa Harris Perry, who is really fierce on this issue. She is a big supporter of free speech. So when she was at Wake Forest, she was a big supporter of the Eudaimonia Center that Jim Otteson was running. So we have a lot of allies on the left that we push away when we blame this on ideology. There are many people who are in favor of education and recognize the importance of viewpoint diversity in ensuring education. So the problem is that I think we need to emphasize the educational importance of safe spaces. So to the extent that people on my side are constantly saying, no, safe spaces are bad, we're making a mistake. We need to recognize that safe spaces protect our side as well as all other sides. So the difficulty that we have is that with viewpoint diversity, in my opinion, and this reminds me of a speech that I made on July 31st, 2014, at Landfall at Wrightsville Beach, where I claimed that leftist students ought to sue universities for non-performance because they have been patted on the head and told, good liberal, here's a cookie. I was at a faculty meeting, a meeting of faculty chairs, department chairs, where the chair of one of our departments of indignation studies said, I'm not going to say which, but one of those departments said, I don't really have to talk to the students on the left very much. They already know what they need to know. I spend my time talking to the conservative students. I was thinking, there's probably a lot of Duke parents that would like to know that their kids learned everything they needed to know in high school. They can come to Duke and just do what they want because they have memorized a catechism. Well, those students ought to sue for non-performance. The students on the right are actually being confronted with smart people they disagree with. Students on the left need to be confronted with smart people they disagree with. And to be fair, Van Jones recognizes that. So there's a lot of people that I think would protect safe spaces. And notice that Van Jones' argument is precisely that you cannot annex the entire university as your own safe space. That it's going to be unsafe and that it should be. That's the nature of universities. So Jacob Levy, a friend of mine who was at McGill University, makes this argument at some length. And his defense of safe spaces, I think, is more effective. It's more drawn out, more effective than anything that I can say. So he makes an argument that might surprise you. Freedom of speech is just not a value at universities, and it shouldn't be. Freedom of speech is not a value at universities. Freedom of speech means that I can hire a ghostwriter to write a book for me or a paper. But if a faculty member hires a ghostwriter to write a book and then puts it up in their tenure file, that would be terrible. If a student hires a ghostwriter and then turns it in as their own work, that's terrible. Academic freedom is something different, which has come responsibilities. It is not a right. Academic freedom is a privilege. And what that means is there are certain limits on what you can do with the freedom that you have to having outside speakers to conduct inquiry and to make arguments. You should do those things only responsibly. So UNC Chapel Hill at the Pit has a free speech area, and some people make fun of that, saying, well, free speech should be the entire university. That's not right. If I'm teaching a class, you don't get to come in and interrupt it and talk about something else. It's a safe space. Classes are safe spaces. If you don't want to take the class, don't take it. Fraternities do not get interrupted by people who disagree with their values. This is a safe space. So the principle of safe spaces would say that academic freedom comes as a result of freedom of association. I have an obligation to exercise that in a way that is responsible. However, within that framework, I get to say pretty much anything that I want to say, and you get to argue with me because I cannot annex the entire university. So it's freedom of association all the way down. And as far as I can tell, there's exactly no one in the entire world who agrees with me on this. Because almost everyone thinks that, yes, we should have freedom of association for my side. But those people, you know how they are. They should not be allowed to speak because they're bad, they're wrong. It's very difficult to stay with that principle. So let me summarize the three questions that I want to raise, and I would be interested. I recognize I've not answered them, but the three challenges that face universities are apportionment of governance, the responsibility for hiring and curriculum. Who's going to decide that? And are there different models that might result in at least competition, whereas now we have more or less a monolithic governance of a collectivist. I don't mean collectivist in a political sense, but I mean a group of faculty who have no stake in the overall outcome and are able to insulate themselves because budgets that come from taxpayers or the funds that come from endowments don't depend on quality or improvement, or in fact even on much energy. Second, who's going to pay for faculty salaries? Who's going to pay tuition? There are, I would expect in the next couple of years, the administration and Congress that we now have is going to make quite a few efforts to remove the responsibility for payment from students also. So we already have a faculty that are largely insulated. If you also have students who are not responsible for the payment of their own tuition, how much worse will it get? And then who's authorized to invite speakers and who can veto speakers? Now, I think one problem we have with this is that usually only the difficulties make the news. Did any of you hear about the riot when I gave a talk at Middlebury College? Because there wasn't one. Damn it! Just chopped liver. This was not long after Charles Murray. And they invited me up, and I thought, oh no, this is bad. And there were 400 students there, and they were just polite and respectful, and it was fine. So, we did. Now, you may have heard about the riot at Duke when Charles Murray came there. No, that wasn't one either. It was very disappointing. So we had a large group of students who watched Charles Murray and asked questions, and there were protesters outside, and you could sort of hear them distantly. That's fine. If you want to protest, go ahead. You just don't get to prevent us from hearing the speaker. So I'm optimistic. I actually think there are many people on the left who firmly believe in viewpoint diversity, not because it's a right. When we try to argue viewpoint diversity that we have a right to jobs on the faculty, that's crap. Conservatives with PhDs are not an oppressed group. We don't deserve affirmative action. In fact, if we try to play victims and get faculty positions as a result, we're just saying that victimhood is the coin that'll be the medium of exchange. Don't do that. The reason why we need viewpoint diversity is that we need to have safe spaces for a variety of points of view so that students can learn by confronting difference, by actually learning, like Van Jones. Van Jones is an ally in this. You need to be able to talk to smart people you disagree with. Brown University has a rent-a-conservative program, and they rent me every 2 or 3 years. And there'll be 200, a Friday night, 7 o'clock, there'll be 200 students, and you can tell they're mad, and they line up afterwards. And usually after the talk, 2 or more will be in tears, and will shake my hand and say, this is why I came to college. I have never heard a smart person I disagreed with before. Thank you. I'm going to go think all weekend about why you're wrong. Because I think you're wrong, but I'm not immediately sure why, and that's what education is. So safe spaces allow us to confront, to try out ideas that in the absence of safe spaces for everyone, exclusive groups for everyone, where no one gets to annex the entirety for their own purposes. That should be the objective of education, and I think that's the future of universities. Thank you.
We do have time for Q&A.
Or comments.
Okay.
Well, 1, 2.
I have a question, which is, what legal rights do public universities have to maintain freedom of association? The Civil Rights Act really gutted that First Amendment right, and our current rules about things like what we're calling gender identity and sexual identity, other frameworks for civil rights are expanding. So do universities actually have any right to allow or to maintain that I can have a group on campus and I can exclude you?
So at first you were asking a much more easy question, and then I realized you were asking a very difficult question. So perhaps I should have gone to John first. Because I'm trying to make a distinction between a rights-based and a policy-based view of safe spaces. So I don't think that safe spaces are a right. What I think is that universities should establish a policy of safe space because of its educational value. You're asking,
Do they have the right?
you're
I'm asking,
asking,
do they
can they
have the
even
right to
do
have
that?
that policy?
Can they even do that?
Yes.
And I don't think that has been litigated. There are probably attorneys here that know more about it than I do, where there may be some particular binding precedent that would prevent it. Because since this is not a rights-based claim, that is, we're not invoking the First Amendment to protect freedom of association, and it's a policy, can a fraternity exclude women? Can a Christian or Muslim organization exclude people who are atheists whose objective it is to disrupt the organization? I think that the answer is yes. I don't think the university administrators are willing to do that, but I don't know. And you asked a very good question, and it's just something outside of my expertise. So if my claim has already been overtaken by events, and there are at least some settings where exclusive groups do not pass constitutional muster, like particularly Title IX, but presumably fraternities do not violate Title IX, as long as, because men's sports don't, as long as there's also women's sports. So fraternities shouldn't violate Title IX as long as there's also sororities. But I don't know the answer, and if someone else does. John, I hope you have an easier question.
Well, by the way, I do think that issue has been litigated lately regarding Christian organizations on campus, and I think that there were victories in that area.
Well, so how
But
do you
not under a freedom of association argument, right? Under a much more limited freedom of religious freedom. And so I wonder if it would still apply when
To
that,
like a conservative club or something?
correct, or fraternity,
Well, my claim is freedom of association per se.
per se.
And it is, when you add the religious part, then sure. John?
Well, I don't know that it's an easy question, but
Well, damn it, who else?
but you made a strong argument earlier, seemingly, that the Board of Trustees, in theory and in law, maybe that's your implication, but it is true. The Board of Trustees in law and in policy have the authority to reject at least tenure requests that come up from the university. That's what this was about. They didn't reject it, as you say, but they could have, in theory. Everybody stipulated they could have, because they said yes, therefore they might have said no. And you argue that basically that the horse is out of the barn, there's not any way for trustees to act. And I wonder, though, if this isn't an important distinction. As a practical matter, shouldn't the Board of Trustees stay out of who gets hired or not? But when it comes to a tenure grant, or a tenure grant to someone who is coming from the university from another sector, or maybe a job that has a lot of money attached, it seems to me that your rule should have some exceptions. Or that law, or a better way to put it is, today, Board of Trustees at public or private universities should be able to assert that there are exceptions. And that's a reasonable argument we can have.
Sure. So the question is, clearly the Board of Trustees has the legal right, and in some ways it has an obligation to oversee the activities of the faculty, particularly hiring for the largest, most prestigious positions, and tenure is, after all, a grant of a lifetime contract. So it could be that we all understand that this is a charade, like the English royalty. So when the Prime Minister goes to the Queen and says, look, we're going to declare war, she doesn't really get to say, no, you are not. Actually, we are. So the Board of Trustees actually does get to decide that. The analogy that I made to Lehman Brothers is, obviously the Treasury Department had the right not to bail out Lehman Brothers. It was just a mistake given expectations. So unless the trustees start to manage expectations and to say, we're going to do this, we're going to take our job seriously, an announcement that this is what the Board of Trustees is going to do. So I think it would take some more groundwork. The reason that this was such a shock was a combination of, it was a surprise, and I would say the political misrepresentation of the Hussman School. I had an argument with a couple of people about this. What was in it for the Hussman School? They, after all, wanted this candidate and they lost her. She had accepted. She was going to come. The 5-year term was okay, and she probably would have gotten tenure pretty soon. Just the ability to portray themselves as being on the right side and as victims seems to have been attractive. Because I actually think this is a pretty predictable outcome. So the dean, in bringing this up, unless she expected this, was just not playing a very good strategic game. So I actually think that it was intentional to embarrass the trustees, which is why I gave that example. We've come to the point where the pressure is on the trustees to resign, not the faculty, if they embarrass the university. So this was a power grab on a larger scale. The Hussman School was willing to give up this faculty member they wanted for the larger point that the trustees had better stay in their own lane. That's speculative. I have no evidence that that's true, but that's my speculation. Otherwise, she's an idiot.
Occam's razor cuts.
One of the difficulties of the safe space, I think is twofold. One is, just by definition, when you talk about a safe space, by definition, you have an unsafe space all around you, so people have to be aware of that, which you're not. The difficulty I see, especially with some of the elitist schools, is that you can have a safe space, let's say at UNC, and you could, let's say you have a group of people that fly the Confederate flag. It may be all right even in that environment, in that milieu, but then you have the media that comes in, and what you're saying is, we talk about safe spaces related to college students, but in this situation we have right now in this environment, we have tremendous media presence and outside influences. And this often will cause a lot of difficulty for safe space.
Sure, and it is disproportionate because for 2 weeks, Nicole Hannah-Jones was on the front page of the News and Observer every day. And they knew full well the facts that I had recited, that she had never in fact been denied tenure. So yes, that's a problem for safe spaces. The university administration has to suck it up and face that because the protection of safe spaces is literally their job. That's the essence of the university. If you lose that, you've lost everything. And if university administrators don't believe that, the legislature needs to get new university administrators. That should be what we're looking for, is someone that accepts the ideals of a liberal university. So you're absolutely right. And then we need better leadership. And it's easy for me to talk because I've got a tenured position to do. Is there a question over here? So, but you're not wrong. That's a real problem. It's just that I don't see university leaders. University leaders are really afraid of that, and we are in a setting where instead of faculty who embarrass the university have to resign, there's pressures from the faculty, from a revolutionary faculty, to say that the administration has to resign if they embarrass us, if they do anything that we don't agree with.
Yeah, your argument reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's argument on religious toleration, in that if you tolerate one, then they'll all be tolerated.
Right, and it's a very difficult, many people will accept that principle, but then they want exceptions. And so the reason why there can't be any exceptions is that we're pretty clever monkeys. We can figure out reasons why morally this thing that I don't like should be the exception. That's okay to oppress. And then you immediately go to hard cases. What of the sons of the Confederate veterans who wear Confederate uniforms and fly the flag at their meetings? What do we do about that?
So it seems to me that the argument that you're making, with which I agree, is based on the idea that you should treat everyone equally.
As a responsible, fully autonomous participant, agent.
So the counter argument of people who are, for example, advocating critical theory, be it critical legal theory, race theory, gender theory, is that that's a sham. The notion that everyone gets treated equally is a sham in the current society. How does one respond to that?
Well,
That's the best response.
there are,
Please give it to me, so I can have it in my pocket.
to be fair, Van Jones in the introduction of his remarks, I didn't read it, but he said, no bigotry, no personal attacks. So it would be hard for us to judge what those are. But if I'm talking maybe about affirmative action or some difficult topic in class, I ask the students to address their comments to me rather than to each other, and not to make any personal sort of arguments. So the question, I think, is the standing of offense. That is, suppose I say something that offends you. It actually does. Does that get legal standing in the sense that it is actionable and you can prevent me from doing that? So the question is, what issues, what offenses to give standing? And of course, it's going to be a difficult problem. Some people, my view of that is that almost no offenses have standing. Others would argue that a lot of offenses should. If that's the level at which we're arguing, I think we have a better chance. You're right that there are many people who would say that pretty much anything that is offensive makes me feel unsafe. And by offend, I mean makes me mad. And I have found that, well, I have often found that students on the right, if they are confronted with an argument they disagree with, usually try to use reason and evidence to respond to it because they're used to doing that. Students on the left simply immediately become angry for two reasons. One, they've never had to make an argument. And second, they found they can win arguments by claiming victimhood. So we're really doing a disservice. So I can tell you what I do. At the beginning of every class, I play that Van Jones interview. And actually a fair number of people will say, okay, I kind of see that. Even the people who would otherwise have advocated for critical race theory. So show that video, it's only 3 minutes long. And he's great. And it's such an unexpected sort of agreement, particularly with some person like you. We have time for at least one more question.
Okay, well, if no one else will
Well,
take it,
I'll take it.
Oh, you want it? Okay, go.
Just double by a second. But one exception might be Antifa. A group like that forms on campus and they want to take action.
No violence. You can't
Okay,
advocate for
so but
violence.
that is the borderline, isn't it?
So that's clearly the crossing. That's the advocating for violence, because that is, you're actually advocating to suppress other people's safety. That violates safe space.
Okay.
So while you're right, I think that's an easier one to handle. The difficult thing to handle is, and let me make the argument that Professor Caldwell made just a little bit more length. Yes, you can say that we should all abide by the rules and that we all have safe spaces, but there are certain groups that are systematically targeted by every kind of group. So it's not that they have any kind of chance to respond, because constantly every part of the society is telling them they're not as good. So this could be women, this could be African Americans, it could be Muslims. So people that feel constantly targeted by almost everything, it's unrealistic to say, well, buck up, be stronger. Because in fact, there is no place where they can be safe, and they should be able to be safe in the classroom rather than constantly be singled out. And they give examples that are actually pretty plausible. If you're the only woman in the class, and the professor says, well, what do girls think? Or you're the only African American in the class, it's like, can you speak for African Americans? Well, no, I can't, and it's wrong for you to single me out. So it is wrong to think that there are no examples where this idea that everyone is equal. It is true that many people who think they have a beef actually do. So parsing this is actually much more complicated than I've made it. I've just tried to elucidate a particular principle. And so you have the last question.
Right. So we learned several years ago that even when UNC really steps in it, nothing happens. The athletic scandal did not result in fewer applications to UNC. Their applications were actually up. They continued to get excellent faculty. People still want to be on the board. Nothing happened. I think the NCAA decided that everything's hunky-dory, no consequences. So in this case, why should anyone feel embarrassment at all if, as you say, if they've got public money, they've got public money and an endowment. They're essentially untouchable. My prediction is that despite all of the sound and fury, there will be very little fallout in terms of, students are still going to come to UNC, donors are still going to donate to UNC.
That may be. A number of faculty have already refused to be interviewed or to come to give talks. So there were some people who were going to come in the fall that have now canceled. And maybe that won't last, maybe that won't be that big a deal. University of Wisconsin, because it constantly flouted the will of the legislature, found that its budget was cut by 60%. And they couldn't make it up with tuition. And so we actually had Duke, we hired 2 of their faculty, really great faculty. Thank you very much. We'll raise the Jolly Roger Gar, we've got your now. So there's a bunch of places that are willing to hire people from top state universities if the budget gets cut. The strange thing is that then people blame the legislature, when in fact it was the faculty for abdicating their responsibility and privilege that they were given in having these safe spaces. So it was the faculty that destroyed the University of Wisconsin, and they really have had problems. So I actually think that's lapsed salaries, that is, positions that were not filled. All you'd have to do is cut these 2 lines that don't have a person in them. And then my budget would have gone to 0, but there's no cut in faculty lines. So that's an easy thing for the legislature to do. So I would predict that there will be consequences. The legislature is likely to start cutting even more lapsed salary lines. And then UNC is going to blame the greedy Republican legislature, where it's actually just a predictable consequence of their own malfeasance. Thanks so much for coming.